right, you guys ready to jump into this?
Ready?
I'm not going to get more ready anytime soon.
All right, here we go.
Now, Mr. Ham, you opted to go first, so you will be first with your 5-minute opening statement.
Well, good evening. I know that not everyone watching this debate will necessarily agree with what I have to say, but I'm an Aussie and live over here in America, and they tell me I have an accent, and so it doesn't matter what I say. Some people tell me, we just like you here saying it.
I have
think he
been
got
told
something
by
right.
qualified Aussies, allegedly, that they apologize for Ken.
I'm giving a 1
It
to
seems
this.
impossible
He
since
got
Australia
something.
is fake.
I think he started with getting something right. A lot of people aren't going to
Okay.
agree with what he has to say.
I mean, that's
All right.
true. Technically accurate. Yeah, we'll take a drink for that, I guess.
This is actually not bad. This is like
But it is-
100
but it-
calories in a can.
Oh,
Oh,
but it does underlying a theme that I've seen that some creationists like to do, which is to pull the "we're persecuted" card. And
Yes.
so he's sort of saying, hey, I know there's people that are going to disagree with me, because that allows them, I believe, to put on this notion of we're having this, righteous
we-
suffering.
Oh, Landon.
Are we at the are we at the hedging his bets already? Like before he's even started?
I mean, to some extent, although, I'll be honest, I think that, saying as a little introductory thing, like, hey, I know you won't listen to me, or you won't agree with me necessarily, but, like,
Hear me out.
here are some reasons to listen, hear me out, is fine. I think maybe going with the accent, I think it's probably just supposed to be a joke, although if it's supposed to be serious, and it's a weird reason to tell people to listen to you, but, like, I don't know, I feel like compared to some of the other, like, persecution porn that, AIG engages in, this is
Yeah.
pretty minor.
Yeah.
And the notion of the Aussie accent having some sort of credibility. If you listen to people like Clive Palmer or Pauline Hanson, who have very authentic Aussie accents, you might not equate Aussie accent with credibility.
Yeah, well, and that's something that's kind of like a psychological study, right? I've heard people talking about that when it comes to people who have a more posh London accent versus a Cockney accent versus like depending on where you're from, that people tend to lean one way or another because they have this expectation of where that person is from. And so because they have ideas about where this person is from, I heard Richard Dawkins talking about it once, saying that because of his accent and how he speaks, people think that he's being far more aggressive than is actually ever intended. And I thought that was fascinating. We did get our first AIG is a bag of dicks from Alicia for 2, who said, handbag, eggplants. So, here we go.
Nice.
Excellent. Okay, so
All right, let's let him go.
So, I hope you enjoy me saying it anyway. Well, the debate topic is this: is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era? You know, when this was first announced on the internet, there were lots of statements like this one from the Richard Dawkins Foundation: scientists should not debate creationists, period. And this one from one of the Discovery.com websites: should scientists debate creationists? You know, right here I believe there's a gross misrepresentation in our culture. We're seeing people in being indoctrinated to believe that creationists can't be scientists. I believe it's all a part of secularists hijacking the word science.
I
So-
forgot how
so-
much of
so-
this was like this. I forgot.
so this notion of
Oh, no.
Can creationists be scientists? The answer, I think, is at most definitely yes. Can
Yeah.
creationists engage in science and rationalize their apologetics for a particular interpretation of Genesis? I do not believe you can be engage in credible science and rationalize, because you start with a conclusion. You start with a priori, this is true, and then you rationalize everything backwards, and that is as unscientific as possible. So are there scientists who are creationists? Yes. Can someone engage in the scientific method credibly and try to engage in creationist apologetics? It would be extraordinarily difficult to do so.
Well, I think there's also a difference between creationists and young Earth creationists. I think there are plenty of scientists who are religious who think that, like, God made the world, etc., etc., and that's fine. That's a big difference than the Earth is under 6,000 years old.
Yeah, well, part of the thing there is that while there have been attempts to sort of claw the word creationism back from anti-evolutionists,
Yeah.
science deniers like Ken Ham, I think that effort has largely failed. And nowadays, if you say I'm a creationist,
You mean
very few people are going to interpret that as anything other than at least older Earth creationists.
So,
Like anti-evolution
are you
is sort of
saying-
part of the package.
Are you saying that him and his crew are doing the thing that they're claiming that other people are doing? Stealing words
Yeah,
and terms and co-opting
kind of.
them? Okay.
I mean, I don't know that they're doing it
On purpose?
as like an intentional thing, right?
Probably
I think that
not,
that's
yeah.
just how the word has kind of, the use of the word has kind of evolved. I remember a time when you could say I'm a creationist and then still kind of go in and say, by which I mean like, oh, I'm a theistic evolutionist, so I accept common ancestry and natural selection, all that stuff. But I think that there's a God and I have some religious belief.
How
I-
many
I think that's less the case now.
How many people do you guys find actually make that argument, though? Do you guys find that people do make the argument that creationists can't be scientists? I see more often that they're a scientist speaking outside of their field.
Yeah, I don't know of anyone I've ever heard say that creationists can't be scientists. There's certainly certain kinds of science you literally cannot do from a creationist perspective.
Sure.
So there's that. But I mean, you can go be all sorts of science. You can go be like a particle physicist and think that evolution is nonsense. Because it's not like it's going to come up. Who cares?
Yeah.
Go find Higgs boson.
But I think that there are sort of the more radical, extreme, anti-religious people that do engage in this notion of you can't be a scientist, blah blah blah. And there are, and that is unfortunate that there are anti-religious people that are as religiously dogmatic as the religious people that they criticize.
Oh yeah, that's true.
I use religiously dogmatic as an adjective, not that atheism is a religion. It's not.
No.
But that's a different story.
So, I don't know, is this just his point dumb enough to drink for?
Yes. No, I had an accident where
take
my beer overflowed, so I'm going to go and get something to fix.
He needed a bigger cup. He needed a mega pint.
It was much more foamy than I expected. It's very good. So I'll be right back.
All right, we'll hit play. He can still hear us.
I want you to meet a modern-day scientist who is a biblical creationist.
My name is Stuart Burgess. I'm a professor of engineering design at Bristol University in the UK.
Hi, Stuart.
So
My
maybe
name
we
is-
should talk about the
please.
Salem hypothesis.
Go for it.
So have either of you heard about the Salem hypothesis before?
I have not.
No.
So this actually comes from ultimately from Reddit on I believe it's r/evolution or r/debate evolution. Sorry. So it was noticed that almost universally, anytime a creationist claimed to have scientific credentials or training, they were in fact actually an engineer.
Yes.
And I don't know if you know, but engineers are not scientists. They are, in fact, well-educated professionals who have a very important job.
Yeah.
But that job is not to do science. It is to take science that has been done and use it for practical applications, which, again, extremely important. I'm not here to knock on engineers. We really need engineers. However, they are not scientists. But creationists love to conflate those things, and also there's a tack on that perhaps part of the reason for the prevalence of engineers among creationists is that engineers focus justifiably on things like design. Engineering is all about designing things. And so perhaps that goes some way to explain this prominence.
And well said, Dapper.
interesting.
I think, again, the notion if you say that engineers are not scientists, it's not meant to impugn engineering. I will say
Right.
that very few engineering training education systems that I've encountered will explain the difference between engineering and science. And unfortunately, in my profession, I find a number of engineers who believe they're scientists, don't understand the scientific method, and then react when they're experiencing a scientific process. So, as an example, in my students, I'd always talk about the fact that in conducting research, we're attempting to ask questions, and we value questions. In fact, we don't even know if the questions we're asking are appropriate for what we're trying to do. The odd number of answers are in the back of the book, and part of research is to figure out those questions and explore it. And engineers sometimes react to questions as in, you're questioning known methodology. So when we were asking very significant questions about mathematical basis of cryptography, we had engineers saying, "How dare you? What gives you the right to challenge right? Because it's a well-established engineering practice on how you encrypt." So there is I think in the disciplines as they're practiced, a very distinct difference and an important difference. It's important that scientists don't try to pretend that they're engaged in engineering discipline, although they can. And it's important that engineers understand as engineers they're not scientists, although they can be, right?
And don't take that you're not a scientist as an insult.
I'm not a scientist. I don't think there's anything wrong with not being a scientist.
And it doesn't mean that you're not educated or don't know about a topic or can't speak on it.
Yeah, and I always, my company, when they gave me the distinguished title of principal engineer, I cringed because I said I'm not an engineer, I'm a scientist. But they didn't have principal scientists. The HR didn't understand that.
So
that being said,
sorry, go ahead.
That being said, what I'm seeing can do is to try to say effectively, we're not stupid. Look, we have smart people or people that have credentials that believe in this creationist stuff. And for the purpose of saying there exist smart people that agree with us, that's as far as it goes. But the notion, the debate topic, I think, given the debate topic, this particular thing he's doing is irrelevant.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, no, I agree.
His point to the matter isn't really relevant.
But what Ken is doing is displaying something that he would find disturbing, as pointed out to it, which is religious people give religious value to science. Ken actually worships science. And what he does to do that is because he's got this interpretation of a particular translation of Genesis, and he's actually a worshiper of science. He's going to try and back rationalize as much as he can to say, see, science agrees with this stuff, as opposed to saying, I'm a Christian, I believe in God, I believe in this doctrine, and I don't care about things otherwise. That's a more honest way. But Ken actually worships science. AIG is actually a worshiper of science, and they try to say we're scientists and we also agree with this. Therefore, because we want to rationalize what it is we hold dear.
Godless Scummer for 2 said, "Spoiler alert! There's this book." And I am looking at this guy's picture. It makes me wonder, like, are we ever going to hit a point in time where having a bunch of books behind you is cringe?
I think it's okay to have a bunch of books behind. What I do is I look to see, okay, what books are you showing? I see Genesis.
It's a bunch of Ken Ham books.
Buried, God, type of thing. That says something about it. I mean, if you saw, because I'm facing this on my bookshelf, there's lots of science stuff and lots of fiction stuff there. But anyway, this notion that these presuppositional stuff that they start with God, they start with their interpretation of usually the King James version of the Bible, I think in some cases, or some version of the Bible, and that's true. But they worship science, and so they're going to try to gel these apologetics to I think in themselves rationalize and try to reinforce their fundamental belief. Now, I'm expecting at the end of this debate to hear Ken do his Christian preaching thing,
Yeah.
and I have a response to him that I'm assuming if he does like he usually does, but I really want to point out, you don't see someone a scientist like Dr. Filipinko go and start his lecture by showing these religious people that agree with him.
Right.
Yeah, because no one cares. What would be the point?
So Ken, you are revealing, in my opinion, that you worship science. You value science, and you want to, and in fact, the whole AIG function seems to be trying to rationalize their belief systems because they really true worship science, and they want their belief system to be put in a scientific context because that makes them feel better.
Are we gonna add a rule for drinking here for what did you call it, the Salem something?
Hypothesis?
Yeah, the
I
Salem
don't think we
hypothesis.
need to.
Okay.
There aren't that many people that he's going to bring up.
All right. Spoilers, Dapper. Let's see where this goes.
Stuart Burgess.
Spoiler
I'm a
every 6
professor
years.
of engineering design at Bristol University in the UK. I have published over 130 scientific papers on the science of design in engineering and biological systems. From my research work, I have found that the scientific evidence fully supports creationism as the best explanation to origins. I've also designed major parts of spacecraft launched by ESA and NASA.
So here's a biblical creationist who's a scientist who's also an inventor.
Now, what does this have to do with the debate proposition?
Well, I mean, we're already off in the weeds because we've gone to origin of life and abiogenesis at best, and not evolution nor the age of the Earth. So,
Could it? And this person, basically, the person says, "Well, I'm an engineer. I'm at this, institution. I published a bunch of the papers, and I also believe that, that in creationism. I don't believe his belief is scientifically credible, and I also continue to posit that what Ken Ham is doing is, in his worship of science, he's trying to help his audience, his choir that he's preaching to, retain their belief in the system by taking what they really value and promoting it as rationalizing their system.
we are up to 5 drinks as we are adding the rule fallacy, because this is a formal
Yes.
debate. So if you see a fallacy, that counts. All right.
Okay.
Let's go.
And I want young people to understand that. The problem, I believe, is this. We need to define terms correctly.
He just
We need
stopped
to define
talking.
creation,
Wait.
evolution in regard to origins.
Wait. Define terms correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
what is correct? What does it mean for a term to be correct?
Whatever.
Dapper is a
Ken
much
Ham-
better linguist than I am. But.
Whatever Ken Ham wants it to be.
So, yeah, from a descriptivist standpoint, right? There's no wrong definition unless it's a definition that people don't understand. So, in one sense, you could say that basically, as long as people understand what you're saying, there's no such thing really as a wrong definition.
Usage.
But there is a sense in which you can say a certain definition is not useful, or when people use it, it leads them to incorrect conclusions, and therefore I think that there should be another definition used. And so I actually think it's fine in a debate to stipulate a definition that you're going to be using going forward. I actually think it's a good thing because it prevents that. So in this case, well, I don't think he's wording it super well in terms of like him saying sort of prescriptively, this is the correct definition. But
Yeah.
when you get down to it,
Now,
it is important that he define his terms.
No, but Ken is doing more than that. He's not simply saying, when I say blah, 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 this is what I mean. he's saying,
Yeah, he's couching this as
you
societal.
need to do so, and he's doing this. I think this dictionary fallacy.
Oh, he's going a step further, because he's not saying you need to do so. He's saying you're in fact doing it wrong, and you're doing it wrong on purpose.
Yeah, and the notion again, this is obvious to linguistics people, but a dictionary, typically most dictionaries describe current usage, not define. Yes. Right? They're not. It's not an engineering glossary. So if you go to like an IEEE standard, they will have what they call a glossary or a dictionary of terms. That when they say IPv4 address, they mean da 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 da. Right? And that's what you do when you're being very careful in your context. But that's a technical description, not a my dictionary says this, therefore the word you use must be this way. So
I will say though, I do think it's fair to suggest that there be a change in the broad societal definition of a term, right? To say, hey, I think we should change what we mean by this. And I think that's closer to what he's trying to do. He's not, look, Ken always couches everything as if I'm correct and you're incorrect and let me correct you. But I think when you dig down to it, if you were to be charitable, because I want to be reasonably charitable to Ken Ham, right? I want to try and take the best version of his argument, the best version of what he's doing. I think what he's attempting to do is to advocate that we change the way that we use certain words. And I think it's fine to do that. So I don't know. I don't really have a huge problem with this part.
And in terms of communication, right? The notion of you can do as it said. I believe it's the was it the caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland who says words mean what I say they mean. The question is who's the master. You can make any definition you want. The question is your communication effective, right? And if you use terms in a way that people don't understand, you're miscommunicating. If you use terms that are confusing, you are not having effective communication. So it's not a matter of your usage is wrong, your usage is ineffective. That being said, in his his things here, so define terms correctly. I'm not going to be as charitable as a Dapper, although I understand your context of trying to be nice. That what Ken Ham is doing is saying this is the truth, right? This is if you don't do this, you're wrong. So if you go back to the page where
has been hijacked by secularists. Now, what is science?
Oh, that was too far back. Sorry, hold on. I jumped forward by accident.
So if you go and you look at what Ken Ham is doing, right?
Go ahead. I'm just going to mute it while it goes forward.
Because I need to read the words.
The problem I believe is this: we need to define terms correctly.
There it is.
So if he was being, more proper, he would say we need to understand the terms we're using. We need to have a common understanding so I can communicate to you effectively, right? That would be a better way to put it. Saying, hey, he's prescribing stuff, and so he says origins, right? And so he's doing the origins thing, and of course he's doing a false dichotomy of creation versus evolution, right? You either are with God or you're an evildoer, right? It's
that's big part of his shtick.
Yeah, and
in fact, it's not even just with God. You have to be with God the way He wants you to be. He has very, very strict rules, is what counts.
Yes, and so again, if he wants to engage in dogma, fine, but he label it as dogma. Don't try to pretend that you worship God when you worship science and back rationalize. And of course, his notion of scientific as science, right? That's an odd thing, but I'm sure we're going to hear him go forward more.
We need to define creation, evolution in regard to origins, and we need to define science. And in this opening statement, I want to concentrate on dealing with the word science. I believe the word science has been hijacked by secularists.
I'm drinking for that. That's maybe that's just a personal thing, but that's really dumb.
By his origin by secularists. And of course, you notice in his use of his words and how he says his words, right? He's not saying, there are secularists that have this interpretation of science. He's saying secularists. He's using code words.
Hijack.
Evildoer stuff, right? And if one were to be anti-religious and pull the same thing, then he'd pull off his persecution thing of the evil, world, so forth. But what is science? Should we actually answer that question? What is science?
I mean, I think we should wait until Bill Nye goes, because I think Bill Nye is going to give a definition and Ken Ham is going to give a definition, and then we can kind of compare.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Now, what is science? Well, the origin of the word comes from the classical Latin scientia, which means to know. And
is that correct, by the way?
The etymology is basically right, yeah. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated, but yeah, ultimately.
He's making the same argument that Aaron Ra makes about atheism.
Well,
the etymology of a word does not dictate what the word's current usage is.
Yes.
Etymology.
Yeah. Isn't that what I said?
You said epitomology, which isn't the thing.
Oh, whoops. Etymology.
I thought you said the study of bugs.
Bugs.
No. Etymology, entomology, they're not the same. They sound similar.
Yes. Just like cosmetology and cosmology. They sound the same.
I'm going to call this a semantic fallacy, or the fallacy of not knowing how words work.
The state of knowing knowledge as science. He said the state of knowing knowledge as distinguished from ignorance or misunderstanding.
Yeah, that's a bad definition.
I'm not sure I'm comfortable with the or misunderstanding, because that implies there's an objective something or other about knowledge.
Drink 2, 1 for fallacy, 1 for bad definition.
State of knowing, right? Usually, by the way, knowledge is is a subset of belief, right? You start off with a belief, and then you go further to bring into knowledge. So knowledge and it's this notion you can know something, be perfectly justified, and be factually incorrect, right? You may believe and know that 0.99999 repeating is some different value than 1, but you'll be incorrect. So knowledge is not necessarily truth.
Right.
You might have, and I guess it's a philosophically, you might have all these justification rationalizations, and your rationalization process of transferring them from belief to knowledge may be false, or basically it may come out to be false knowledge. So when someone proves to you that 0.999 in decimal repeating
I don't know if
equals 1.
I don't know if defining what knowledge is really something that science does. Right, that's more
philosophy.
Philosophy, yeah. Defining
I'm not a
knowledge,
philosopher.
different subsets and different kinds of knowledge, and how you define knowledge, or whether or not knowledge is even obtainable at all, is a realm in philosophy, not currently a realm in science. So you're already starting to wiggle into confusing terminology. If you want to talk about having to define your terms, science is a little bit more solid of a term than knowledge is.
Yeah, and so his distinguished from ignorance, right? Again, this is also implying stuff, and of course he's saying Merriam-Webster. Now, if he said, when I talk about state of knowing, I mean knowledge as I distinguish from there, but he's trying to lay down the biblical glossary and say, if you don't do this, you're wrong, you're evil, you're a secularist, who are bad people who are hijacking this stuff because they don't know what science is.
Yeah.
Speaking of stipulative definitions, I like to go with the old-fashioned definition of secular, where basically anything that isn't literally owned by a church counts as secular.
That is fun.
Yes.
I like that.
And in fact, there's a lot of stuff where the whole notion of secular law came from notion of property, right? Even marriage became, in some areas, a distinguished about property and inheritance that was quite important from a point of view of the church. And
if you look up a dictionary, it'll say science means state of knowing, knowledge, but there's different types of knowledge, and I believe this is where the confusion lies. There's experimental or observational science, as we call it. That's using the scientific method, observation, measurement, experiment, testing. That's what produces our technology, computers,
Here it
spacecraft,
comes.
jet planes, smoke detectors, looking at DNA, antibiotics, medicines and vaccines. You see, all scientists, whether creationists or evolutionists, actually
this is back
have
when AIG
the
was
same
pro-vax.
Wait. You know, he has said all scientists, be it they creationists, and you remember how he says, or the evolutionists, right? First of all, that's a false dichotomy. There are scientists.
Drink for false dichotomy.
There are scientists who do not understand or do not
It's a
know or
fallacy.
do not have an opinion on what he calls origins. And this is not a us-them sort of thing that you're trying to do. Because again, Kim, in addition to worshiping science, you also worship money. And you want people to think your Ark Encounter AIG is a bag of thingies group are the ones that are going to protect the truth. And the way you protect the truth is give them money, right? That's part of what's going on with you, Mr. Ham. The difference between you and the other K person that has a T on it, and I'll let you decide what the T means. Difference is that you, Ken, are willing to suck off the taxpayer, where the other person has these weird beliefs
That's what
about.
she said.
So I'm going on there, but I think it's important to talk about the foundation of what this person's doing, because they're laying traps. He's laying all these traps on the systems with his notion. So this notion of experimental versus observational science.
Yeah, but he's about to probably go into like historical science that is not observable, whatever the fuck that means.
So the notion that a science is experimental observational, right? I think is a false notion, right? As part of the scientific method, there are observations. As part of the scientific method, there can be observations, there can be experiments. But the notion of a science being experimental or observational, I think is problematic. And
It is.
It's something that scientists sometimes get mixed up in. There is unfortunately in scientific circles a level of elitism. Like, if you're not this kind of science, you're not a real scientist. They talk about soft science or other sorts of things that they consider not to be.
There are arbitrary lines that get drawn in some cases.
Yeah, and that is something I think that is very damaging within the scientific community, right? Mm-hmm. I may not appreciate matters relating to, let's say, political science.
Sure.
But I'm not going to sit there and say you're not a scientist. On the other hand, I'm not going to sit there and say, well, just because you do the squishy stuff, you're not as hardcore science. The notion of hardcore science or hard science versus soft science, I think is a really problematic thing. Because I think if you want to get the education of scientists, you need, in addition to some very detailed studies of things you're interested in focusing on, you need also a broad liberal arts view of education, right? Yeah. And if you want to go on to become an astronomer, be sure to study art, study music, study literature, study philosophy, study anthropology, study psychology, economics, business, law. These are things that, while there might not be scientific, are going to be very important for you to draw on. And even I find in my career, even when I'm doing something so-called hardcore, like computational number theory of the integer set, blah, 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 I have to draw on things outside of that core area frequently. So the notion of science being, well, it's this correct thing or you're just squishy thing, and that's a little bit of what Ken is engaging here of, well, there's experimental and there's observational.
What are you observing if not an experiment?
Well, that's one of the things is that AIG likes to draw this strict division between experiments in laboratories and observations, right? So, like, I guess astronomy doesn't count because you can't put a star in a lab, so that's not experimental. That's just observational science. Okay, great. Who cares?
You can put a star in a computer, though.
Yeah, but the whole point of a laboratory experiment.
Yeah. Yep.
The whole point of a laboratory experiment is to gain an observation, right?
Right.
And the reason you do it in a laboratory is because hopefully you can control for various phenomena or for various factors that you don't want to examine, so you can control for those. But in some cases that you can't do that. But that doesn't make your observation any less part of science because it wasn't made in a laboratory. But here's the other spoiler: when there are laboratory experiments that shows that AIG are full of shit, they don't care about that anyway, even though it is the observational science that they claim to like. This is all just smoke and mirrors. They don't actually care about this distinction, except that it's convenient sometimes. And whenever it becomes inconvenient, they drop it immediately.
And it's very important when you publish scientific stuff and you're publishing things that were influenced by experiments or by observation. By the way, typically you do an experiment, you observe. So the notion of an experiment being this independent thing from observing is actually ridiculous. In fact, a lot of stuff in physics, we've learned the act of observation has an impact on the system. And so the notion that you can distinguish the two is non-scientific. So Ken, if you're going to worship science, at least understand what you're worshiping. But moreover,
that's okay. He doesn't understand the Bible either.
Yeah, but moreover, the notion understand that observations are problematic. I mean, the thing that Feynman kept repeating to me is that we as humans have a nearly infinite capacity to deceive ourselves, and he was always worried that he has deceived himself, right? And so he kept going back to fundamentals. So why he spent time trying to teach me relativity and quantum mechanics, being one of the people who probably knew those things better than maybe N-5 people in the world, was because he was always concerned that even with his fame, his fortune, and so forth, that he's deceived himself. There's something there he doesn't understand. And we know from law, a different category, that witnesses and testimony can be quite problematic. And we also know from science that observations can be quite problematic. I mean, some disciplines go through the notion of doing this double-blind test and so forth to try to minimize that. But the notion that you could do an experiment and not observe is absurd.
What's the point?
Right.
But experiment, as Dapper, I like that Dapper said, is to control values. Now, and I understand that there's a lot of things that some people say, well, we'll never be able to do this, right? I think you run into problems because, for example, you're talking about stars. Well, we have experiments now where we do have fusion. The ignition lab at Livermore creates little star things and there's a wonderful bunch of astrophysics because now we have these little controlled experiments that we can ask questions. We can make predictions and see if those predictions are validated by the data coming out of the experiment. That's a scientific process.
Now, in Ken Ham's defense, this did come out 6 years ago, so there have been some changes in the world since this came out, but,
Yeah, like he's gone anti-vax instead of being pro-vax.
Yeah, he's anti-vax now. Yep. But we are almost an hour in, and we haven't even made it through Ken Ham's 5-minute opening.
I'm sorry, but I think that's a very important to talk about his foundation because he's going to be misusing this stuff. Sorry for Canada.
Now let's do it again.
Here we go.
Observational or experimental science. And it doesn't matter whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist, you can be a great scientist. For instance, here's an atheist who is a great scientist, Craig Venter, one of the first researchers to sequence the human genome. Or Dr. Raymond Damadian. He is a man who...
So what is a great scientist?
Oh, God. This is too philosophical of a question.
I don't know.
Ken Ham, Landon.
I think the answer is... Good.
Oh, sorry. Raymond Damadian was not the inventor of the MRI machine. he was a part of a team that developed the MRI machine, and he was a relatively minor part of that team according to the rest of the team, but of course, not according to Dr. Raymond Damadian.
And MRI originally was nuclear magnetic resonance, but nuclear, freaked out people. It's based upon well-established science, and it was an engineering implementation of scientific principles that created this wonderful medical device.
Why is Ken Ham
now,
okay with the sequencing of the human genome?
But the fact that he's saying, look, here's a person that's done great things. Now this person might have patents, it might be an inventor, but that does not make you a scientist.
Right. He's actually, as far as I know, not a scientist. He's a medical doctor.
Yeah, it says MD in the corner there.
Yeah, which it's a fine thing to be. It's just not the same thing as.
I have a very a great physicist friend of mine who's also an MD and does stuff on oncology, right? And he's got his PhD in physics, and then went and got his degree in medicine, and he applies physics principles into medicine. This sort of similar thing. This person may have taken a lot of science courses, may have understood the science of magnetic resonance, and then worked on a team that developed a device that's been very useful for medicine. But the notion
that is in fact what he did.
The notion that what makes a great scientist, in my opinion, a great scientist is a person who asked great questions to the right type of person at the right time. Probably the highest compliment you can pay to scientists is this person asked, valuable questions to the right people at the right time, and that makes you great. So Einstein's greatness doesn't come from the engineering that came from it. Doesn't come from all the medical devices that came from it and all the other things. It came to the fact that he was asked the right questions at the right time when people understood the context of the right people.
That sounds like to be a great scientist, you have to be lucky with connections.
Yes, but you also need to be able to communicate.
Sure.
And you need to understand the method of communication, right? The great scientists are not the ones that have the answers. They're the people who have the question. Because again, unlike dogma that Ken is pushing, science values questions, not answers. Science values exploring, not engineering results.
Yeah, being successful in science doesn't mean you got your hypothesis right. It means that you were able to take a step forward based on the question you asked and the result of that question.
And again, I know we're spending a lot of time on this context, but I think again this is kind of uncovering the intellectual problems, I'll be charitable, of AIG and Ken.
Who invented the MRI scanner and revolutionized medicine. He's a biblical creationist. But I want us to also understand molecules to man evolution belief has nothing to do with developing technology. You see, when we're talking about origins...
molecules to what?
Molecules he said to man has nothing to do with advancing technology.
So what do you suppose molecules to man means?
I think he means evolution, and he means abiogenesis.
And
that's exactly what
developing
he means,
technology. But of course he's also saying this scientific process and
really
entrepreneurial thing that often involves engineering as well as economics, right? Developing technology. What does that have to do with? No, but I think he's probably saying that because he's trying to rationalize why did I take an inventor and then say this person's also a creationist, right?
Well, he's trying to say that evolution, whether you believe in it or not, has nothing to do with whether or not we can advance technology as it is now to a better spot, but it's completely negating that all science feeds into each other. So, like, if you want to do history, depending on what part of history you're studying, you're going to want to study social sciences, you want to study art, or you're going to want to study chemistry, right? And then you're going to want, if you want to study chemistry, you need to know some physics, and if you want to know some physics, you need to know some math. So like all of these things are all tied into together and into each other.
But who gives a damn whether or not there are creationists that have done other things, right? That has nothing to do with is creation a viable, scientific methodology.
Well,
right?
he's saying it's at least
I can sit there and say
detriment. He's saying it's not a detriment.
Galois, who founded a major branch of mathematics, was also a Catholic. Well, what does it have to do with it? I could say, Erudish, one of the most prolific mathematicians in history, also couldn't identify a bowl of rice.
From goo to you. That sounds like a children's book about evolution.
And by the way, that is true. Erudish had to be explained. I explained to him that the bowl of rice in front of him was food and he needed to eat it. He was that.
That's a lot.
He was an interesting person.
Out of play.
I want us to also understand molecules to man evolution belief has nothing to do with developing technology. You see, when we're talking about origins, we're talking about the past. We're talking about our origins. We weren't there. You can't observe that, whether it's molecules to man evolution or whether it's a creation account. When you're talking about the past, we like to call that origins or historical science, knowledge concerning the past. Here at the Creation Museum, we make no apology about the fact that our origins or historical science actually is based upon the biblical account of origins.
So he's basically just said that we're acknowledging that our science is made up and we weren't there, so we don't really know, but so is yours. It's like, what?
Go ahead. Please go ahead. Go ahead, Doug. I have something else.
No. So basically, but his comeback is going to be, but God was there, and God is trustworthy. The problem being that is the reason he's making the claim, is because he says God says this. You can't then use that claim as evidence for the claim. That's just question begging.
Yeah. So we're back into fallacies.
Another thing I think this is a fallacy. Another thing I think that happens, which I think is disingenuous, right? And the reason why it's disingenuous is that I know that there are AIG people and probably Ham who understand this, but their presuppositionalist craziness compels them to ignore it. And it is this, right? They'll say, when you bring up something about, let's say, the age of the universe or age of the earth, they'll say you weren't there.
Yep.
So you can't say it with any scientific purpose, right? They do this thing because you weren't there, you didn't observe. Because somehow observational science is somehow special. If you didn't see it,
you don't know it.
Well, Ken, and I'm talking to you, Ken. You weren't there when Abraham allegedly tried to murder his son. You weren't there when allegedly the Israelites left Egypt to go into the so-called Promised Land. You weren't there when the book of Genesis was written. You weren't there when your so-called Savior died on the cross. You weren't there when Moses, parted the Red Sea, all this stuff. But you weren't there when Noah went the boat and so forth, right? So if you're going to apply this science stuff, science wasn't there when the earth was formed, therefore they don't know what they're doing. I'm going to say to you, the foundations of your faith, you weren't there. And if you're going to be so disingenuous to say, I as Landon Knoll, can't make measurements that to give a age approximation of the Big Bang, therefore what I'm doing is rubbish, I'll say to you, the foundations of your entire faith is on the same faulty grounds. I understand. I don't hold to this notion of if you weren't there, it is you just make it up. And they go and right, they have these rationalizations about, well, how do I know that how do they know that Abraham existed, right? They weren't there, right? And they'll go to all this stuff. Well, there's all this faith and all this religion, all these people that testify. And the answer is, we do not have evidence credible evidence that Abraham ever existed. Some people present that, and there's an argument, there's debate over it. But Kinham wasn't there. So if he's going to tell me I can't date the universe based upon experiments and observation and scientific method, I'm going to say to him, your entire Christianity faith, you weren't there, and therefore you can't bring that up as well. It's going to play that game. It applies to you as well.
A drink for Landon beast mode, first off.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Needed. Second off,
It's
I
just
think...
and the IAG people know this. They know this, but
I'm
they
just
don't.
worried that, like, the answer to Landon's valid point is going to be that, but God was there and God influenced the Bible, therefore the Bible is true because God's the one who wrote it and he was there, so therefore it's trustworthy.
And I know in my Christian upbringing and experience in apologetics, as I'm very good in that sort of craziness, I sit there and say, well, the Holy Spirit brings forward knowledge of this personal relationship with your Savior, so you have personal knowledge, and you go in Bible study and go to church, and the community, you can learn all this stuff and have direct revelations from God. And I know that shtick that they go and pull, right, to rationalize the fact they weren't there. Sure. But it does disturb people to find out that there are, instead of the Bible being this, quote, historical document of high precision, has lots and lots of things that do not match the archaeological record, that there's lack of evidence of a lot of things in the Bible. And that disturbs Ken. But he doesn't play, and I don't mind if he wants to rationalize stuff. What I do mind is him being disingenuous and knowing it. He's disingenuous about science wasn't there, so they can't say about radioactive decay, down the line. But he doesn't apply that to his foundations of faith.
And he's also trying to say that he does apply it too. He's trying to say that, well, at our museum, we know that we weren't there for this, and therefore
Yeah.
But he's not actually applying it across the board. He's
So
internally
first of all,
inconsistent.
that he calls it God's word,
Sure.
I have issue with that. The fact that he says in his translation of this Bible text and how the Bible was put together, go to Milk of the Atheist, you learn all about how the texts of the Bible were put together. But even that, the notion that he that he wasn't there, and that a lot of stuff in that book cannot be validated, right? The flood cannot be validated scientifically. Even the principal characters in the story, of there being a Moses, there being an Abraham, so forth, there is a lack of significant evidence to show that those entities even existed.
I would probably argue you can likely find evidence to the contrary in some cases.
And I know about the how example Hebrew traditionalist apologetics talk about the faith and origins and the traditions and all these people testifying stuff. I know about the Jesus stuff, and you go to this particular person who had this writing, they had a word Jesus in there, and I know that sort of stuff. And historians can have really good debates about that set.
Yeah, Jesus
but
mythicism.
Ken was not there. He did not observe. He just guesses, and he chooses to cherry pick what he wants and discount others. Why? Because he worships science. He's a money person trying to get money to come back to AIG, who is a bag of appendages, in my opinion.
He's a money person. All right, play. He's an overly fuzzy monopoly man.
Now, when you research science textbooks being used in public schools, what we found is this. By and large, their origins or historical science is based upon man's ideas about the past, for instance, the ideas of Darwin.
Okay, so real quick before he goes on, I'm just going to be real fast about this. Biology textbooks and textbooks in schools do not differentiate historical science from observational science from experimental science. These are not different.
Right.
There are no definitive lines between these things in any of these textbooks. So if you actually wanted the information of the research that they did, good luck, because it's a pretty arbitrary line of deciding what is and what is not historical science.
Yeah.
All right. I just wanted to
scientists
put that one out
don't, and scientists do not have saints and people they worship. This notion that Darwin is somehow special is really a religious dogma problem. They're projecting their notions onto science, right? What makes Feynman great is not that he's some saint physicist of the fact that he was extraordinary in his ability to ask questions, extraordinary in his ability to communicate and to educate. That's part of it. But the fact that it's Feynman, we don't worship Feynman because he's a saint in the scientific world. We don't worship Darwin. And in fact, we understand that these very significant scientists make mistakes. They also have things that they ask questions, which we learn later on might not even be the proper question. But this is a problem with some of these religious apologetics, that they think somehow that their saints and their holy people somehow apply to science.
Can we point out,
Dapper, in your study of biology, do they have like shrines to Darwin other than the sarcastic ones? Is that?
No, not that I'm aware of. not that I'm aware of.
You're not required to go to your to catechisms to learn your Darwin.
Actually, no. In fact, in most biology courses, you're unlikely to really talk about Darwin more than for like maybe a paragraph about like, hey, he's the guy who kind of came up with natural selection. Okay, let's move on now, because there's Darwin essentially has no more relevance to modern biology than Newton does to modern physics, which is to say, he came up with really important concepts that are foundational to a lot of aspects of physics. But we've moved on. We don't really need to read Principia Mathematica to understand modern calculus and physics.
Yeah, and we understand that Newton was a great scientist who was really significant in writing asked questions. But we also know his Principia Mathematica is full of errors. And in fact, if you study it, you typically will study Laplace, who was very kind, essentially fix a number of bugs, fill in a bunch of details that Newton kind of glossed over, and so forth. So it is dangerous to worship a scientist, because what will happen is that some people will start to defend the scientist based upon a cult, and not see things that are there. So a lot of people, when the Newtonian models began to be challenged by Einstein and relativity, and being by people such as Schrödinger and Planck and the people involved in quantum mechanics, there are a lot of people who came back and said, "How dare you, question Saint Newton or Saint Leibniz or Saint blah blah blah." That was as unscientific as you can get. Mm-hmm. So stop telling about Darwin blah 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 and Darwinists, right? They're not Darwinists, right?
I mean,
and also it's like saying Einstein.
Good.
Go ahead, Ever.
Oh, I was gonna say it's just the same as saying like, oh, you're a Newtonist, or you're I don't even know, like any other scientist. Like, you're not an Einsteinist if you study special relativity. You're not a Newtonist if you're studying mechanics. You're not I don't know, an ohmist if you're studying like electricity. Like, that's just not how any of this works.
Ohmist.
And understand that some of these great scientists were rejected in their initially. For example, Ohm's law, which most people in engineering and science would say, well, isn't that true, right? When Ohm came out with his law, it was panned in part because it went against some people who were really worshiping these great engineers and scientists, and saw this thing, and even though the data was there to clearly show there were people like Ham, but scientists who were doing this worship thing and needed to be sort of moved out of the way because the data didn't explore it. Also, the notion of religion of naturalism, right? There may be somebody whose religion is naturalism, but the notion of naturalism or atheism, right? He says / atheism, right? He's doing that little equating there because there are naturalists who are not necessarily good.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was going to say that you can be an atheist and not be a naturalist. You can be an atheist and believe in ghosts and demons and angels. You just can't believe in gods.
Atheism isn't in biological textbooks.
Yeah, and for discussions about philosophical stuff about atheism, I would refer you to a number of people online whose names we know that talk about that. But this notion of naturalism or science being a religion, I think is false. Now Ken might worship science like it's a religion, but doesn't make science a religion if he worships it in that way.
I gotta hit play because he's actually put on screen the exact thing I was talking about, so that's awfully nice of him.
And our research has found that public school textbooks are using the same word science for observational science and historical science. They arbitrarily define science as naturalism and outlaw the supernatural. They present molecules to man evolution as fact. They are imposing, I believe, the religion of naturalism or atheism on generations of students.
And
so many
drink, we drink, and we drink, and we drink some more for everything he just said.
Insert the Star Wars thing about nearly everything word you said was wrong. Ken,
yes.
Everything you said was wrong. And moreover, I believe you know it.
Well, it's the
I believe you know it's wrong.
He's arbitrarily defining science and arbitrarily dividing things into historical science and observational science. He's like, well, they just use an overarching word for everything. Well, they co-opt scientism.
Now,
Drink.
Zaffer is a really, he's quite knowledgeable about history, and the history of science is a very important branch of history. A person that I would recommend that you follow is a lady who says Kathy loves physics, and she has a really good book called Lightning Tamers, and she's talking about the history of development of electricity and Maxwell and Tesla and Edison, all the engineering, all this sort of, and that's quite a fascinating thing. She also mixes in with it some of the science stuff, so you get to learn about Maxwell's equations and so forth. But the development of it is a fascinating history thing. I don't think that's what he means by historical science. I think he's talking about science that you observe, and then science that is from stuff from the past. And he's trying to say that one is science and another isn't.
Everything happens in the past.
Basically, so Ken Ham has a problem in that his ideas contradict essentially every branch of science that you could name. It's almost impossible. I've never found a branch of science that does not contradict something that Ken Ham believes when taken seriously, right? I've tried. I thought maybe optics, but then people pointed out that Ken Ham's beliefs require light not to work the way that we know it to in some instances. Therefore, no, optics also is a problem for young Earth creationism. So, I mean, I was really trying. So anyway, as a result, he needs to find a way that he can, at least with credibility among his audience, separate science into the good parts and the bad parts. Mm-hmm. And so he's made several arbitrary distinctions about sciences that he doesn't like versus science that he does. And so one of the things that he does is use this observational versus historical. But then he also likes to complain about science which is not interested in the supernatural, not because the supernatural doesn't exist, that wouldn't be interested either way, but because the supernatural is fundamentally not the object of study of science, right? Asking science to talk about the supernatural is like asking, say, a mathematician to give you an expert level discourse on like cell biology. Why would you do that? That's not what math is. That's not what a mathematician does, right? So what he likes to do is say, oh, well, we should include God as an option. But the problem is that even if God did do a thing, right? Like, let's say that there's something that we encounter in the world, and it's directly created miraculously by God. that doesn't help with science. Science is about things that we can use to make reliable predictions in the future on the basis of the information and the data that we gain.
Yeah.
And so if you can't make predictions on the base of it, then who cares? Even if it's true, it's not part of science. It might be part of something else. That's why things like answering the question like, hey, what route did Hannibal use to cross the Alps? It's not really a scientific question, because that doesn't help you make future predictions about any new data, really. It just tells you what one thing happened. On the other hand, if you say, hey, how is it that elephants survive at high temperatures in European mountain ranges? Well, that could give you new predictions about what might happen if you decided to take an elephant into the Alps. That's a
and history can
question.
make use of scientific processes in furthering understand history, right?
Right.
That's a really important thing.
So Ken is basically just complaining that science is useful, because the reason science is useful is it only includes options that allow you to make predictions, which God isn't one of them. If you say, okay, look, God created this rock. Yeah, if you see God created this rock, well, okay, that doesn't tell me how rocks come about. It doesn't tell me where to find other rocks like it. It tells me nothing about that rock other than it's a miracle, which, from a historical standpoint, if we say it's true, okay, that's interesting. But again, it's not useful in the scientific sense. Yeah. And not everything has to be, right? Like, but that is not science. Like, it's not scientific to talk about, like, your relationship with family members, because that's just one-off instances. It doesn't give us any predictability about future instances. However, it's still important to you.
But in a large amount, in a large quantity, over like certain
if we were
time
talking
periods, you can do social
humans'
studies
relationships.
about that. Right. Yeah.
But that's the difference between like anecdotes and data.
Right.
And again, another really important point of this whole thing is that that science again values questions, and science is constant. The scientific method constantly challenges and questions its own situations. So even though I say that the theories of relativity, the theories of quantum mechanics are some of the most extraordinarily well-tested theories in science, one still
says that about their
challenges
own theory.
them. It's one of It's one of the, again, I say it's one of the more well-established things in science. You still challenge it, right? Because again, as I say, in learning relativity and quantum mechanics, and I bought into the mathematics of relativity, but I was disturbed with some of the implications of quantum mechanics. And so we'll go and test it. So I spent several years challenging and testing both relativity and quantum mechanics. And that was good. I don't see Ken Ham challenging articles of his faith, challenging claims of historical figures, or figures whether they're true or not. I don't see him applying that same method to his religion, right? Someone who challenges saying, well, did Noah really exist? Did Abraham really exist? Is there a God? I don't, that is seen as being apostate. Where in science, you are as a student encouraged to challenge the foundations and to test them. And guess what? Occasionally we discover that something isn't quite what we thought it was, and we learn and we celebrate that person for having asked the right question at the right time to the right people and made progress.
My unfinished chapter 5 says AIG is a crate of cocks. Holding off on alliteration because I don't want to use more than 2 Ks. Hey.
Yeah. So the notion of science as naturalism, right? Science, is an endeavor that builds and organizes knowledge. Using testable experiments, predictions about your universe. Where naturalism is a philosophical notion about the natural laws and forces that operate in the universe, right? They're not the same thing.
Yeah, it's confusing science and philosophy, and it's not like science or philosophy don't have anything to say about each other, and that's fine, and there are bridges you can gap there, but to use them interchangeably is, I think, an error at best.
Yeah. But there are scientists who are naturalists. There are naturalists who are scientists, but there are scientists who are not naturalists, right? There are scientists who have great faith in religious things and they don't apply that. There are naturalists who don't hold to the scientific method, right? The notion of defining science and naturalism, right? Because he's equated science with religion, naturalism with religion. Again, is a bit of projection, a bit of false dichotomy.
All right, I have blame.
But again, go ahead.
You see, I assert that the word science has been hijacked by secularists in teaching evolution to force the religion of naturalism on generations of kids. Secular evolutionists teach that all life developed by natural...
I assert that AIG wants to hijack science to push their dogma onto kids, that they're worshiping the scientific method, but they're using this presumption as this is God is true, this particular thing in Genesis is true, and they want to push that on the kids.
I think
right?
I would go a step in a different direction.
A bit of projection.
They want to utilize and weaponize science in line with their religious dogma, so that way they can control people and enforce their morality and moral lines on other people.
Yeah, and control their economic purse strings of their believers. But why doesn't he sit there and say science is evil because they don't believe in God, blah blah blah, and scientists are denials of the Christian faith, which is not true. There are many scientists that are quite religious. But why doesn't he do that? He's again secretly worshiping the scientific method, and then saying, but only if it matches our dogma.
He's got a pentagram under his desk that says E equals MC squares in the middle.
Processes from some primordial form. That man is just an evolved animal, which has great bearing on how we view life and death. For instance, as Bill states,
it's very hard to accept for many of us that when you die, it's over.
But you see, the Bible gives a totally different account of origins, of who we are, where we came from, the meaning of life, and our future. That through one man, sin entered the world, and death through sin, but that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, whoever believes in him should not perish and have everlasting life.
Drink for preaching. Wait. Uh-huh.
So...
I want to point out we're not using the KJV, so we're at least away from the KJV.
That's nice.
And isn't it in KJV? Isn't that the new...
Yeah.
There's two different KJVs.
Kind of. The new KJV is a translation that uses some of the traditional translation methods that were used in the KJV, but it also corrects a lot of the things that were just mistranslations in the KJV.
Yeah.
And also uses, more current English than, 17th century English.
I would encourage you to check out Mock the Atheist channel. They go into a lot of stuff about biblical texts. They actually, even though atheists, they're actually quite significant students in studying religion and studying Christianity, and you can get a lot of information about KJV stuff and so forth. There's a fascinating bit about linguistics and a fascinating about history that is in there. Still, Ken started talking about death, right? And I want to say this with all politeness and all kindness. I, Landon Noel, will die. Dapper, even though he's a dinosaur of great age, will die. Chesh, Canadian Goblin she is, will die. You, the person listening to me right now, you will die. Ken will die.
Come for the drinks, stay for the free existential crises.
Hey, guess what? This is part of life. Death is part of life. And I would encourage, I would beg you, don't let this fear of death overly impact your life. Embrace it. It's going to happen anyway. And there's a number of people who are involved in religion. I'd say all, but a number of people who are involved in religion because they think religion is going to give them a get out of death jail free card. Guess what? You're going to die. And the question is, well, what will happen? I believe that I will experience the same condition that I experienced before I was born.
Thanks to denial, I'm immortal.
So Ken, I would say that the tragedy of your life is you've devoted so much energy into hoping you're not going to die and hoping your religion is going to give you an escape from death, that you are willing to commit effectively intellectual suicide while you worship scientific method and the money that comes in
We are
on your
so
organization, right?
On the other hand,
and again, I want to say this in sincerity. Please get over your fear of death. It's going to happen anyway, and spend the time now while you're alive to make value of it. Now, I would encourage you to do that.
there's another addition to that though too, right? Don't let your fear of death be taken advantage of by people like Ken Ham. It's okay to be afraid of death. It's okay to be uncomfortable, and those are feelings that everybody's going to have to deal with and everybody's going to have to work out. But the other thing is that Ken Ham's version of Christianity teaches that it's not just the good people who believe in God that get to live forever. Everybody gets to live forever. This just depends on where you go.
Yeah, and some religions have various things about stuff, but the notion of having a happy time after life.
Yeah, but
is the notion that they're
right, or or a fear that you're going to have a bad time forever, right? It's all tied in together. So I mean, just don't try not to get taken advantage of to your whatever your fears may or may not be. And it's it is hard. It's Bill Nye was right in the clip that he showed. Shit ain't easy, man.
And Ken, Ken doesn't know this to be the case. He hasn't been there.
He hasn't been there. He hasn't seen it. He doesn't know. He wasn't there.
But again, I'm not saying you can't be religious. Do what you want. I'm encouraging you to spend your time while you're alive, valuing and making something of this now. That's the portion of saying, because you'll die, and it's something. It's one of the things that one of the greatest things that my mother, who died, gave me and taught me was the dying process.
I'm drinking
and how
for
it's part of life, and how you should embrace it. But understand, I think some of the damage that people like Ken Ham and his religious stuff does is gives you this false notion of you do this, you play this prayer, you do these, believe these things, and you'll have eternal life. And people will then one, waste much of their time while they're still alive on this sort of stuff, as well as then basically destroying the ability to actually understand the universe. It's a tragedy. So nothing wrong with being religious. Just I would encourage you to get over your death problem, because it's going to happen to you anyway, whether you like it or not.
So, is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era?
No.
Yeah, what the hell did any of that have to do with
Literally nothing.
Revolution is real or not?
No, nothing. It had to do
this
with.
whole thing so far has been absolute non sequiturs.
Yes, it had to do. It had to do with his worship of the scientific method. It had to do with his promoting of his AIG bag of appendages and the money that comes from the followers and the accolades. Right? It had to do with that, but we finally get to the debate topic. Is it a viable model of origins in today's scientific method era? I say resoundingly
origins.
No.
Well, he's still conflating origins and abiogenesis with the topic of evolution. Ernie Matthews 5 says, another great show and chat. Thanks, Chesh and Cast. Thank you, Landon and Dapper, for joining us. I'm ending the stream. I'm just kidding. Thank you so much for thank you very much for super chatting. If you've been super chatting so far, if you are a member, thank you so much for supporting. It is greatly appreciated. So thank you so much out there.
And thank you, Rich. And again, if you're religious, please don't think I'm calling you crazy. Or so I'm just pleading with you. Value your life now, because that's what you're going to have. But
I say the creation evolution debate is a conflict between two philosophical worldviews based on two different accounts of origins or science beliefs, and creation is the only viable model of historical science confirmed by observational science in today's modern scientific era.
Okay,
that was a long sentence of saying nothing, ultimately.
No, it is not confirmed by observational science. In fact, observational science exposes fundamental flaws to this creationist stuff, and even in the modern scientific era. is there, and so his dichotomies are wrong, and his statement is wrong.
I'm drinking
and
a
in fact,
really
I think
dumb.
I don't. Dapper, do you have any comments on that? On the last two slides?
I mean, I think I already made the comments that I need to about the fact that Ken Ham has this problem where he needs to just dismiss science. Yeah. That's where I put my focus. I don't have any additional comment on things like how you should value your life or your afterlife. Like,
yeah, it's not.
I don't comment on that. Yeah, it's not relevant to this question that's being asked. Turns out I don't think that the answer to the question of whether or not life evolved has direct impact on the question of whether there's an afterlife or what it's like or how to get to a good version of it if there is one. I don't think it's relevant.
And that is time. I have the unenviable job of being...
Holy shit, we made it 5 minutes. Yay!
I'm sorry, but I thought we needed to basically understand the impending... And notice, by the way, he had 4 minutes and 50 seconds of stuff, and then he finally, at the end, talked about the debate topic, but didn't actually
He didn't say anything about it. He just made a statement about what his position is. And I guess that's kind of what your opening is supposed to be.
And I would turn to him, if I were doing the opening thing on the other side, I would turn to him and say, Ken, I feel really bad about what appears to be the tragedy of your life and how much effort you waste on avoiding what you think is a avoidable death, how you worship the scientific method but pretend not to do so.
It would be
in
really...
the hopes that your life and your work and your foundation will continue to thrive economically.
The entire thing that Ken Ham just said could be just dismissed by saying, like, well, yeah, man, that's just like your opinion.
Someone who sits there and says, I reject scientific method, I reject the philosophy of naturalism, I reject the rational processes, and instead are in the spiritual. They're at least being honest.
Yeah, fair.
In my opinion, Ken knows some of the stuff in his heart, using his terms, but his fear of the lack of eternal life forces him to rationalize things, forces him to commit what apparently is intellectual suicide, and that's the tragedy of Ken.
All right.
I think he's capable of doing great things, but not.
The timekeeper here. So I'm like the referee in football that you don't like, but I will periodically, if either one of our debaters runs over on anything, I will stop them in the name of keeping it fair for all. Mr. Ham, thank you for your comments. Now it's Mr. Nye's turn for a 5-minute opening statement.